Egypt land, you shall gain the victory. Way over in the Egypt land, you shall gain the day. March on, and you shall gain the victory. March on, and you shall gain the day. Way over in the
Welcome to Clinton Church Restoration's online community read of The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. The mission of Clinton Church Restoration is to create an African-American heritage site and cultural center at the historic Clinton AME Zion Church in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where W.E.B. Du Bois was born and raised. As a cultural hub inspired by Du Bois's work as a seminal writer, scholar, and activist, this new center will use interpretive exhibits and contemporary programming to explore his complex life and legacy, celebrate the work of this Freedom Church, and share hidden and untold stories of African-American life in rural New England. Our 14-week community read of The Souls of Black Folk will be moderated by Dr. Francis Jones-Sneed, historian, board member, and chair of our Scholars Council. Each week she will be joined by a guest scholar for a presentation of a single chapter of Du Bois's classic text, followed by a discussion with the audience. If you are joining us live, we invite and appreciate your participation. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. For best results, we recommend you have the most recent version of the Zoom app downloaded on your device. Attendees watching via a browser may not have all the interactive features available. To see the full schedule for this community read or to learn more about the project, please visit our website at clintonchurchrestoration.org. Thanks for joining us.
Way over in the Egypt land, you shall gain the victory. Way over in the Egypt land, you shall gain the day. March on, and you shall gain the victory. March on, and you shall gain the day. Way over in the Egypt land, ye shall gain the victory. Way over in the Egypt land, you shall gain the day. March on, and you shall gain the victory. March on, and you shall gain the day.
Good evening, and welcome to our sixth session of the community reading of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. We are very pleased to have this evening as our guest scholar, Dr. Horace Ballard from the Williams College Museum of Art. Dr. Ballard is a curator of American art and specializes in the American art of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. He received a PhD from Brown University and is currently preparing a book manuscript entitled The Reconstruction of Beauty, Photography, Whiteness, and U.S. Masculinity, 1865 to 1900. We will begin our discussion with remarks from Dr. Ballard, followed by questions from the participants. Please feel free to enter your questions at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Welcome, Dr. Ballard.
Thank you so incredibly much for having me, Dr. Jones-Sneed. The invitation was such a balm to my spirit in these times, and I am so honored to be here with you, with the entire Clinton Church community, and I also want to thank Eugenie Sills, Interim Executive Director of Clinton Church. And I also want to thank all of you for joining us. And before I begin, I would just like to say that today, December 1st, is a very important day for me. It's the day that in 1989 and then 1990, activists and agitators who were participating in what was then just the New York group of ACT UP, and then it expanded across the country and even the world, organized what they called a Day Without Art to mark the hundreds of thousands of folk in the art world who lost their lives to either AIDS or complications of HIV. And December 1st is also the day that in my own kind of history, I remember two folks, one whom I met, though I was very young, and one whom I did not meet, who were so instrumental to my own training as a Black man. And that would be James Baldwin and the incredible dancer Alvin Ailey, who both passed away on December 1st. Before we dive in to chapter 6 of The Souls of Black Folk, I thought I would begin just to situate us in Du Bois's own life, in his own training as a Black man. And I thought I'd begin with two photographs very quickly to give you a sense of Du Bois as a young man. And thank you so much, Beth. So the one that we're seeing here on the screen is perhaps my favorite photograph of W.E.B. Du Bois. It is from his high school graduation photograph from 1884 at Great Barrington High School. He is the shortest and the youngest of 9 graduating students. And one of the things that I love about this photograph, and one of the things that makes it such an incredible image to write on, is the fact that Du Bois is breaking all kinds of visual gestures and poses here. He is the only one standing with crossed legs, and you can tell by kind of the twerk or the swivel of the shoulders. He is breaking the what seems to be a kind of gender expressing boy girl pattern. He is the only student with a hat, and he is wearing a wonderful, wonderful little straw boater hat. And as we also see, he is quite a handsome young man. And if we can have the other image, please. Thank you. This is W.E.B. Du Bois, known as Burghardt, to his colleagues and friends at the commencement day in 1888 at Fisk University. He is seated here in the front row to our left, the composition's right. And this is, I would argue, the photograph of Du Bois as a young person that begins to help us understand the ways in which, I argue, he is conscientiously self-fashioning himself and sitting for photographs, knowing that they will be viewed by history at much later and future times. If we can see here, look at that positioning, kind of contrapposto seated. Look at those feet and those boots. Look at that hair. I love these images of a very conscientious sculpting of Black masculinity, one that is deeply assured, yet knows that one's body in public space is still deeply contested. Thank you for those images. So as I said, my remarks fall into two camps. The first is I just want to kind of give a sense of Du Bois's own education, and then talk about chapter 6, a situation within Souls of Black Folk, and how Du Bois is continuing in the chapter a long, ongoing conversation, particularly with Booker T. Washington and the faction of both African Americans themselves, but also white supporters of African American education between a classical liberal arts education and a technical agrarian industrial education. So W.E.B. Du Bois is born in Berkshire County in 1868, and not much is known about his primary education, but beginning with his first years of high school, we begin to know a lot. Du Bois's principal at Great Barrington was a man by the name of Frank Hosmer. And Hosmer was a graduate of Amherst. And when Du Bois was in his junior year, he was only 14 and a half years old. He started high school quite young. And he already had a kind of convivial, conversational French. He was great in music. He had a little bit of Latin. He had a little bit of German. And Hosmer thought that Du Bois could go to Harvard from Great Barrington, but to do so, he needed to pass the language examinations in Greek and Latin. And Hosmer came to Du Bois's house, talked to his mother, Mary, and gave them a supply list that included 5 books in Greek. They did not have the money for them. And a white woman in town, a Mrs. Russell, who was the mother of a young man who could not go to school, had to be homeschooled because he was very sickly, and Du Bois came once a week to play with him. She bought his books for him. Du Bois ran the high school newspaper. He was a decent singer, and from his mother, Mary, and also at school, became a quite decent piano player. When he graduated in 1884, he did not go directly to college. Many African Americans at the time did not. They took a few years, primarily to work so they could earn money. And Hosmer, as well as Du Bois's family, members of the Clinton Church, were trying to see if they could raise enough funds to send Du Bois to Harvard so he could live at a colored rooming house, as it was known during those days, and so that he could then attend classes. But in that year, between 1884 and then the spring of 1885, Du Bois's mother died. And after the funeral, he thought that he needed to leave. He needed to go out, he needed a new scene, and he needed to start his education. And Du Bois went on full scholarship to Fisk University in Nashville. At Fisk, Du Bois was a classic scholar. He also played a lot of music. He was head of the Sunday school division, and he also spent a lot of time, it seems, socializing and dancing and wooing women. And and he had quite a wonderful time at Fisk, but the ways in which he describes it, which I think are really interesting, is that he remembers Fisk as being a school where a lot of the still illegitimate children of very, very wealthy Southern planter class families were sent, and also a place where a lot of children of major US politicians who were biracial were sent. And from this, Du Bois begins to have an understanding that it's not just black and white, that there is colorism and class hierarchies associated with color, even within Black communities. When he graduates from Fisk in 3.5 years, Du Bois wants to go to Harvard. And there is a program that does allow Black men who have high marks and have taken degrees from what we now call historically Black colleges and universities to attend Harvard. But you cannot just go to Harvard for a graduate degree, a postgraduate as it was known then. Even if you qualify, all Black students, regardless of their qualifications and their prior training, had to take 2 quote unquote remedial years. And Du Bois hated this. But as he said in his journals, one does what one must do. And Du Bois takes a series of essentially college writing classes and college preparedness writing classes called Writing ABC. And he also has to take an analytical course. And the analytical course is a course that I think probably changes his life. It's taught by a very young, very astute, just fresh from the Sorbonne, new professor who had been just a rising star in the Harvard philosophy department just 5 years before. He went abroad, now he's back. And it was, of all people, William James, the famed pragmatist and philosopher, while he is turning his dissertation into his first book, Varieties of Religious Experience. And of course, William James is the younger brother of Henry James. And William James and his wife take a deep interest in Du Bois. In fact, when Du Bois is chosen by his classmates, white and black, to be the commencement speaker after those 2 years, so in 1890, William James buys Du Bois a suit of worsted wool, a three-piece suit of worsted wool lined with silk. It is the first suit, full suit, that he has ever worn and been given. And this makes an incredible impression on him. William James also introduces Du Bois to his young people, who is just back from the Freie Universität in Berlin. And this is the incredible philosopher George Santayana. And Du Bois writes in his journal that seeing Santayana for the first time at William James's salon, speaking in German, French, and something that vaguely sounds Mediterranean. Santayana could speak fluent Spanish and Portuguese as well. Bespeaking, Du Bois says, the qualities of a nation, Du Bois automatically falls into an intellectual crush on George Santayana. And I think that the feeling is mutual because George Santayana then cast Du Bois in all of his theatrical productions for like the next 2 years at Harvard. In 1891, 1892, somewhere in there, in a conversation with William James and George Santayana, Du Bois realizes that it's not history or economics that he wants a degree in. He wants a degree in political economy, which is a discipline that has kind of appendages in lots of disciplines, everything from political science to the history of aesthetics to moral philosophy to what is now sociology. But because Harvard doesn't have it, the only place he can go to get it, particularly so that he can teach at an institution of Harvard's ilk around the world, is in Germany. He needs to go to Berlin, and he does. And so Du Bois from 1892 to 1894 is at the Freie Universität in Berlin, which is then, while he's there, is going to be renamed for Kaiser Wilhelm II, who will become an important figure for Du Bois. And then, of course, today is known as von Humboldt University in Berlin. So imagine Du Bois from Great Barrington, after all his world, the entire community rallies to try to send him to Harvard. There is deep loss and trauma. He goes to Fisk. Now he is at Harvard, and he's realizing that even here, he's not going to get quite what he wants. He wants what's called the German degree in political economy. And William James and George Santayana write his letters of recommendations. He goes, he's walking down the Unter den Linden. He walks into the Aula, the great hall where just a generation before his great hero, Hegel, was lecturing on art and moral philosophy. And a generation before Hegel, Schiller came from Jena to lecture. And then before Schiller, Kant, right? And Du Bois says, I read Faustus and I and I dated pretty people and I saw beautiful cathedrals. He had a wonderful time in Berlin, not without heartache, not without an understanding that racism continues beyond the geospatial limits of just a state and just an ocean. But his mind is free. And he has a very important teacher who stands in deep support of, after only 3 semesters, granting Du Bois a doctorate in political economy. And this is the younger brother of the composer Richard Wagner. This is Karl Wagner. And Wagner is Du Bois's favorite composer. And I'll come back to the important connections between Du Bois and the Wagner family a bit later, particularly for the reason why Du Bois was in Berlin in 1936 and was not at the Olympics to see Jesse Owens break the color barrier, but was instead at Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle. Sadly, even with Karl Wagner's support, there is a chemistry faculty member who will not allow Du Bois to only be there for 3 semesters and take a doctorate, no matter what his scores on the exams are, no matter his fluency in multiple languages. And so Du Bois comes back to Harvard and is deeply disappointed and strikes up a deal with the philosophy and histories department that he can finish essentially a master's thesis on the suppression of the slave trade and its economics and its social import for the northern states. He can finish that in 18 months and take his doctorate in history while he goes to teach at Wilberforce in Ohio. So that is broad strokes, kind of Du Bois's education, let's say, from the ages of about 13 until he is 28 years old. And I should say that it's really important to note that at Wilberforce, Du Bois is the professor of classics. And in 1895, after understanding that his degree has been granted from Harvard, he gives a really important talk, one that I have written about quite a bit. Is called The Art in the Art Galleries of Europe, in which he proposes that in order for a moral life and a political life of what he calls aesthetic disinterestedness and purposiveness, terms directly out of Schiller and Kant, Black men must understand that the work of human hands is beautiful, and that in the contemplation of beauty and in the contemplation of what he calls natural sublimity, very Emersonian, one can come to peace and one can come to harmony with the self, which then leads to a life where one can lead because one is disinterested in what is good for the self, but deeply invested in what is good for the whole, what is good for society. It's an old kind of moral proposition straight out of German idealism, but it's one that I think, at least through Du Bois's 30s, 40s, we will see him employ over and over again. Now, Chapter 6, my favorite chapter, The Training of Black Men and the Soul of Black Folk, begins with an epigram by Omar Khayyam from the Rubaiyat, which was published in 1859, which is itself a fiction. It was translated from Persian by Scott Fitzgerald, and Fitzgerald plays deeply fast and loose with the Farsi and the Persian. And so it is itself a translation that has always been considered more a response to a work of art than a pure transliteration of the work of art itself. It is ekphrasis. It is the imbibing of a system so deeply that one can externally share it and create it anew. And I think that that epigram is really interesting for this chapter. It's also good to know that Du Bois is penning The Souls of Black Folk when he is 33 years old. And it's really important to note, because it's not lost on Du Bois, that there are two great works from the 19th century also penned by men when they reach the age of 33. And this, of course, is Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass and the first autobiography of Frederick Douglass. So several of the essays in The Souls of Black Folks were previously published in The Atlantic. And from the great kind of fireside poets of the Atlantic, including Emerson, we get this idea of double consciousness, right? This is something that we all know well, but I think it always values repeating and rethinking through for each of these chapters. Emerson is distinguishing between the human or the personal and the divine ability to see, to be the eye that eyes, the eye that see, right? And Du Bois takes this language, but he takes it and in that kind of incredible sense of signification and signifying on the signifier, Du Bois is like, double consciousness is what every single Black American is experiencing all the time, right? One is always experiencing the way that one thinks about oneself and one's community, and the way that that community is being viewed by the outside. Always, always, that in every action, in every interaction, in every possible futurity for oneself, one is always thinking about what is good for me, what is good for my community, and how will it be read both by my community and by the outside world. And this, of course, is a weight and a labor, and this weight and labor create the miasma that is the veil. Okay. I find the sixth chapter really interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, and as Dr. Jones-Sneed and I were talking about before beginning, the sixth chapter is a continuation of the third chapter. It's almost a doubling, it's a redoubling of Du Bois's long-standing critique and wrestling and kind of parallel sensibility with Booker T. Washington around the need for technical education, yes, and right? And what is the best education 3 to 4 decades after the Emancipation Proclamation to create a generation who have the will to contemplate, create a future for themselves that goes beyond just putting bread on the table, in Du Bois's sense, that goes from subsistence to culture, reason, and the creation of character. Individualism is Du Bois's word. And so in this wholesale racial progress, everyone agrees that education is needed. But what kind of education allows a person to become a man? And the term man for Du Bois is loaded, particularly in an essay about how to turn individualistic, not in the ways of selfish, but meaning kind of self-sufficient Black youth into men. And that this kind of, the use of the word man is hegemonic. It absolutely is, absolutely is. And it is also deeply reoccurring in Du Bois's writing in his first 40 years. Du Bois talks a lot about Teutonic manhood, this kind of sense of not a Nietzschean superman or super race, but this Teutonicism, of which he says folks like Frederick Douglass and Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, are emblematic. And Kaiser Wilhelm, Friedrich II, this sense of men who can stand on the world stage and reason with anyone in the world, whether or not their reason is sound. That is not what Du Bois is arguing for, but he's arguing for an education that allows anybody, particularly Black youth, to be able to do that. And the only education he can imagine doing that is the kind of education that he had, is one deeply trained in the classics, but also deeply trained in the histories. And as we heard so beautiful as this conversation began, the sorrow songs, the music, the culture, both religious, political, spiritual, communal, of Black life in the Americas. To kind of conclude this moment, I want to be very clear kind of about some of the steps that Du Bois takes here. For those of us who have read and love Christina Sharp's In the Wake, we start this chapter in the wake, right? Du Bois is like, in the wake of slavery and in the wake of cultural oppression, there are kind of three modes or streams of thought about race in America. The first, Du Bois says, is a kind of, there should be unity and cooperation between the races. The second he calls the old Southern way, that gave permission to slavery. And this is the way that comes from a kind of 18th century Enlightenment ideal that holds that Blacks are intermediary, or a third category, a tertium quid, Du Bois says. They're not quite human, but they're higher than animals. They're quote unquote, as Du Bois writes, quoting a slaveholder, lovable within their limitations, but the one thing they're uniquely suited for is working the land, right? And you can already tell that in that second, Du Bois is really like, if this was the way that superstructures of racial tyranny, violence, and trauma were meant to keep us subservient always, by keeping us just skilled enough to be agricultural laborers and boost the economy of the Southern states, why would we want that to be the one main educational thread that we continue into the 20th century? And then there's kind of a third stream of thought, Du Bois says, which is Black people thinking about themselves, yearning for freedom, yearning for self-ideation, yearning for self-fashioning, yearning for equality, but deeply cognizant, even in their own personal and communal longing, that 2/3 of the world already see them as having already achieved the highest sense of unity they could achieve, or sees them as less than human, right? And that's not going to change, that racism doesn't just change with legal precedent. And so Du Bois argues that the amplification of educational institutions that emerged in the South between about 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, and 1876, the end of Reconstruction, that these normal schools, these industrial schools, they are not enough. And he points to what he calls the 30,000 teachers that intergeneration went out throughout the South and essentially eradicated illiteracy, not completely from the South and not completely from Black communities, but eradicated it so much that no one could then say, as a sociologist, that literacy was endemic to Black culture. He goes, if we did that once, we're no longer done with that. We now need to go higher. We need to go bigger, right? That generation of teachers was admirable, and they created, and you see what he does to Booker T. Washington. He says, that generation made Tuskegee possible. Well done. Now we need more. Now we want to get them to not just the Fisks and the Spelmans, we want to get them to Harvard, right? Fair Harvard, he calls it. And how do we do that? We have to have an educational system that is aspirational, that allows one to see oneself not just as an experiencer of culture, but a formidable agent in culture, right? The kind of education that allows one to choose their future for themselves. I'll stop there, and we can drill down more and look to moments in the text. But again, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this incredible opportunity to kick off this such an important chapter and a work that means so much to me and my family. And I'm excited for a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ballard. What a very, very interesting presentation. And I especially love that you began with an overview of Du Bois and his education, which becomes so important, I think, in his own views about overall education for African Americans. Our first question comes from Emily Oles, who is teaches in the public school system here in Berkshire County. She says, I found the prose in this chapter particularly moving and poetic. Do you have a favorite passage or paragraph stylistically? Emily is not only a social studies teacher, she's also a literature teacher. I think you can tell by that question. So.
Oh, you know, I do. And if those are with me, I'm going to turn to the very last paragraph of the chapter. Because I think what Du Bois does here is he does something that I feel is deeply sutured to the African American kind of poetic and lyrical traditions. But it's also deeply, I think, resonant with kind of language from the King James Bible and from Shakespeare. And in fact, he evokes Shakespeare. So that very last paragraph, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come all graciously with no scorn nor condescension. So, wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. And then he continues. But I love that one. And I also just want to raise, you know, he's doing something pretty darn cool here. Dumas has, but I don't believe at this moment Balzac has been translated into English yet. I think this is Du Bois saying, oh, Balzac, Dumas, I know them. They're kind of contemporary. I read them in French. Right? Like, it's pretty cool.
Thank you. Mr. Edward Brenson's asks, in this chapter, Du Bois mentions the talented 10th. What do you think he meant by that term?
I'm so glad that you asked that question. And if you don't mind, I'm looking in my book, the 1989 edition on page 74 at the top. Here then is the plain thirst for training. By refusing to give this talented 10th the key to knowledge, can any sane man imagine that they will lightly lay aside their yearning and contentedly become hewers of wood and drawers of water? You know, that kind of evocation of the talented 10th, which of course, in the next decades of Du Bois's life, particularly when he is the editor of Crisis and Opportunity, will become so central to Black life. To include it here, I think there are two things. One is the way that, quote unquote, the new Negro that Du Bois considers himself in, and the ones that he knows from school, the ways they think of themselves as being this generation after slavery that has been given certain monikers of privilege, whether by having light skin, family connections, a great education, or some of all of the above, and other monikers of privilege. They feel that they are the talented 10th, the Negroes who, from their early school days, could read and write. So I think that we're also seeing now kind of a, I don't want to say slang, but a slippage between kind of the ways that very privileged, college educated African Americans are defining themselves and how that's slowly moving over into kind of larger culture, particularly literary culture. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I know that that question is always a big question from scholars and others and readers of the text in talking about Du Bois as elitist in his outlook by using that a definition of the talented 10th to point out his kind of elitism in that kind of way. But surely this chapter begins, The Souls of Black Folks is the first text, I think, that really in earnest tries to delve into what race and racism is in the United States and its impact, not only on African Americans, but also on the whole of the United States in looking at that. Do you think, and it seems that scholars says that from this chapter, Du Bois is saying that the antidote to racism is education. Do you get that from the chapter?
You know, I do not get that from the chapter. What I get from the chapter is Du Bois saying racism is racism, and it is real and it is a force. And we know that education is the key to helping people self-advocate and to giving them the tools of kind of self-comportment, of self-care, of self-knowledge, of self-respect, and of dignity, that they can withstand racism. And that perhaps individually within their own circles, and then maybe generationally, we will be able to move to a kind of cooperation with the races. But I don't see Du Bois here saying, if we could just get all Black people to Harvard, racism will go away. I don't see him saying that, no. And I also want to point out, you were so right on, Dr. Jones-Sneed. Du Bois is elitist. And it's hard, but he is. And there are moments when he acknowledges it. There are moments when he actively works past it, when he's reaching out to unify Black America, particularly I think in the 20s and the 30s. But we all know, when one is in the archives, there are literally thousands of letters. I don't think anyone didn't call him Dr. Du Bois unless they had known him since he was a child. Even Yolande, his daughter, calls him Dr. Du Bois. He's like, there's a way. Du Bois believes in respectability politics.
Yes.
100%.
Yes, yes. It's really interesting in his time at the NAACP and his relationship with Spingarn. They had a really close relationship, but indeed, they always used that respect with each other, and he was always Dr. Du Bois, so it's really kind of interesting. But just going on that thread of education again, I don't think that a lot of people understand what kind of education that Du Bois actually received when he was at Fisk. Fisk, some people call it the Black Harvard of the South, was the best of the historically Black institutions at the time that Du Bois attended it. And that's the reason that he was going to be there. These schools were founded by white missionaries, as Christian kind of academies, and their leadership and most of their instructors were also white. And so a lot of what's happening within those institutions is a kind of reteaching of the assimilationist kind of theories coming from white institutions. And so I think we just need to make that very clear about what kind of education that he got there. Certainly he was immersed into Black culture, but a different kind of Black culture than what we know of historically Black institution being in the middle of the 20th century, I think, so.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right, 100%. Fisk gives him a concerted pride in the race, specifically because it's the first time he's been in that seminar room and seen 20 people who all look like him speaking another language, who have all traveled, who have all talked about going to their families for dinner, who know the right places to buy their clothes, right? Who know the value of an education, what it took to get there. You're exactly right. And I think that in the way that Du Bois was mentored, that kind of those assimilationist politics that come from young, very well educated Methodist and Congregationalist men and women who are coming south during Reconstruction to found these universities. And for Fisk, I believe, even had a pipeline from Amherst, from Harvard, from Princeton Seminary of students who worked there for 2 or 3 years before going off to their parishes or the law offices. And I can imagine that it also was very comfortable for Du Bois to do that because he had that at his high school.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes.
Right? And so he's getting this kind of education that says you can and you must and you will, and he knows that he's doing it at the level of any other white man in any other college classroom in the country. Because of that training. You're exactly right.
Yes. Andrew Blickman asked, did Du Bois write or speak publicly about what happened to the nation Germany, where he studied at the peak of its intellectual prowess, which soon fell into 2 barbaric wars culminating in genocide? Did he travel there again during his lifetime?
what a beautiful question. To my understanding, Du Bois went back to Germany twice after leaving in 1894. He went very, very briefly at the end of the 1920s and experienced for only a few days. He was really there to see the Cathedral of Cologne again, the kind of Weimar scene in Berlin. And then, of course, he goes for a longer visit for a month in 1936. You know, Du Bois, to my knowledge, never, I'm sure he did, I'm sure in conversation he did, but to my knowledge, in his written texts, he does not specifically address what happened to the Germany that he loved. No. What we do see, I think, are two things. Number one, starting in about 1935, he does begin to talk openly about making some changes to the souls of Black folk, particularly how he got into a back and forth with his good friend and editor, Frank Shift, about how some of the language, particularly in chapters, I think 7 and 9, and then chapter 2, around the relationship between Blacks and Jews, that Du Bois did not take it as racist. His friend Shift was like, this is a bit anti-Semitic. And Du Bois was like, no, I didn't intend it that way. But we start to see around 1935, 36, 37, a growing consciousness within Du Bois that, you know, I may not now, I may not have the time, but if I ever do another edition, I would change that. He was like, I do not mean that. I was thinking from the personal being a place of the political, and the folks in those positions in my encounters were Jewish, but their religion had nothing to do with the interaction that I want to discuss. I need to rephrase that and change that. And in the second edition, he does.
He does, yes.
He does. But so that's one moment where it's not Germany, but I think just kind of a wider zeitgeist makes him realize that's not a place we want to go.
Yeah.
And then later in his life, maybe in the 1950s, he is asked, did he go to the Olympics in 1936? He says no. He talks about Wagner. And his students are looking at him a bit incredulously. and he said something to the effect of, and there are probably people listening who might remember this better. It's in a letter that Shirley Du Bois saved at UMass Amherst in that great collection. But he said, the trip was planned before I knew who was speaking. I will not be used as a political pawn, but my relationship to the music, to art, and to the Wagner family goes back to the other century. I could not say no to an invitation from my former faculty mentor.
Yeah.
And so but those are the only two times that I would say that the atrocities of the Nazi regime and the Third Reich after the fall of Kaiser Wilhelm II's government, he ever addressed.
Yeah. Nadine Wedderburn, a future guest here, says, here Du Bois says most Americans answer our queries regarding the Negro a priori, and that the least that human courtesy can do is listen to evidence. Would you say this may be thought of as Du Bois's articulation of critical race theory before it was called that? If not, how do you interpret this statement?
I love, and I have that passage underlined. I love it, right? I interpreted it when I read it as a sense of two things. Both Americans understand that the Negro is also American and that the Negro is a fact. And the Negro is a fact of both colonial power, racial subjugation, and white supremacy, point blank, right? They may not articulate it as such, but the Negro is here. And I love that question, because what Du Bois is saying is, but that it doesn't stop there, right? It doesn't stop there. Yes, we're here, but why are we here, and how are we here, and how does our continuation also necessarily impinge upon your own whiteness? Right? Your whiteness doesn't exist if we were not here. But instead of just talking about it abstractly, let's look at data. And so I think for Du Bois, this is also a moment where even in his lyricism, even in his prose, he's turning our attention to hold both theory and quantitative data at the same time. He's like, we can do the work of political economy. It is deeply cultural work. It is deeply moral work. It is work based on data points and data sets. We can do it. So I love that idea that he's turning us to critical race theory and sociology before they're even named in those ways.
Yes, I agree. Marisa Massery asks, thank you for this presentation. Du Bois writes in this chapter, quote, but when we have vaguely said that education will set this tangle straight, what have we uttered but a truism, unquote. I appreciate this because it seems to go along with the concept you just aligned with, stating that education alone will not solve racism. Would you be willing to comment on how you see this dynamic play out today in 2020?
Oh, you know, most immediately, you know, I right before we began, Dr. Jones-Sneed and I were talking, and I was like, I can't believe this is like my fourth winter in the Berkshires. And I did all of my graduate work in New England, but I'm originally from the South, Virginia and North Carolina, and that is where I consider home. And all through K-12 and for college, I went to public schools. I went to the University of Virginia. And so coming to the Northeast for my master's and my doctorate, and teaching at one of the great colleges in the world, at Williams, I am seeing that the efforts to quote unquote integrate and diversify that sadly were started decades too late, but are still ongoing, and at least were started, that has yielded in the Williams population and in the population of the schools that I attended incredible gains. But the dissonance and the disconnect between what it means to bring students in versus what it means to support their growth, and the resources and the centers and the foundations needed for a true diversity of experience, that is lacking, I think, in the American education system. And if it's lacking at the schools that I attended, and if it's lacking at Williams, it's lacking everywhere. And so that's where I see this kind of tangle now. It's, yes, many of these schools are integrated, and many of the admissions committees are deeply trained and deeply committed, I truly believe, honestly, to diversify not just around race, but the entire sensorium of identities and expressions of humanity. But the institutions are still based on 19th and the first half of 20th century outmoded practices of education designed to fit very particular class of white men. And while those who can play the game rise, I think society has taught us that that's not even the game we should be playing. right? And I think that that is something where I could see Du Bois's language and words being so interesting now. He was just like, yes, technical education, this is good. But what more? We need more. This isn't enough. And this can't be the only path. Now I think about him calling upon, great, they're here, but how do you support them? Where is their community? Where do they get their hair done? What does religious experience look like? How are they getting back and forth? Those things are what really allow not just for equality, but equity. And equity is interesting. It would be interesting to think about if Du Bois would have even argued for equity. But we have to argue for it now. And that is something I find fascinating.
Yeah, it's very interesting in this chapter that it seems that Du Bois is arguing for African Americans to be the authorities of how race is discussed, how we are discussed in this country, and not just as that second kind of wave of people who are, jolly and interesting, but to leave it to the white society to decide what race and what racism is, to decide where our place should be in this world market, one way or the other, that Du Bois is arguing that the African American can do it for themselves, and that what whites should be doing is listening to us necessarily. But we're still fighting that same battle, it seems, within educational institutions, within the prison systems, within politics, the whole 9 yards, it seems. We are still fighting that same kind of thing. And that's what makes Du Bois so interesting to me. Here he is in 1903, and many of these essays were written before 1903, laying it out for us about exactly what it needs to be. And then we turn around and we're turning back to him in 2020 and saying, we've come a little bit of the way, but we still have a long way to go in this, progress, as we would call it.
Yes. Oh my goodness, you're spot on. You're spot on. And I love what you said, and I just want to amplify it. That sense of a totality, a sense of an entire system. It's just not education. It's just not politics. It's just not the prison industrial complex. It's just not enfranchisement. It's just not extrajudicial violence against police. It's all of it.
Yes.
And you're so right. Du Bois calls our attention. And perhaps in some ways, that's the debate with Booker T. Washington, right? Booker T. Washington is like, I want to get people self-sufficient, self-actualized, self-capable communities that are respected and well-regarded. And Du Bois is like, yes, we all want that. You're so right. But it's a huge system, right? And until we have Black physicians and lawyers and police officers and doctors and chefs, and he even says artisans and clergy and cooks, until we have a larger percentage of people graduating and self-deciding that they can go into those fields and make changes across the various economic sectors, we will never even have true actualization, because people won't see it, so they don't know that they can believe it. Mm-hmm. And if it's just one or two people, racism will always squelch them.
Yes. And it's just so interesting that that whole kind of self-realization that Booker T. Washington was talking about, self-sufficiency, making it on our own. We see, going back in history, that the white power structure didn't like that either. When we looked at, the all-black towns being burned down, they were very self-sufficient, within the capitalist model of success. But the white power structure didn't like that. And so Booker T said that they would respect that once we got to that stage, but he was proven wrong. as far as that's concerned. And I think that was what Du Bois was talking about. There's not one thing that we can do in order to subsidize this kind of system without having the whole equity of what it means to be human. We cannot give that away. So
absolutely.
It's been so wonderful having you here this evening, Dr. Ballard, and having this conversation about Chapter 6. We wish you well, and we look forward to your publications, to read it. And I hope that in that publication that it's now at the editors kind of looking at, I hope there was some Du Boisian philosophy included in that beauty, that kind of deconstruction, that kind of beauty as we look, because as we talked about it, I could just see several pictures of Du Bois, starting with his high school graduation, going all the way to 1900, the Paris Exposition, and on to see that kind of change. And I would love to see a piece from you on just the changes in Du Bois's, character through photographs. It would just be kind of wonderful. But I think we have one last question. To what extent was the Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois conflict over education related to competition for scarce resources, especially from the white North?
Ooh, how fascinating. How fascinating. I should say on that, I do not know. What I can say is that I think you also have two men. Booker T is a little bit older, and Booker T. Washington was born in slavery. Du Bois was not, right? And Booker T. Washington is from the South. Du Bois is not. So you have two men, couple years apart, but of the same generation, with fundamentally different narratives of family lineage and belonging to the country. That's one. Plus, you have a different education system. That's two. So thus, it would not surprise me then that the narratives they have to tell to white moderates who would support them would look very interesting. Du Bois, who has the same, let's say, educational structures and some of the same friends, we know him, but there's no limits on his mind. That's kind of scary, right? Booker T. Washington, who is a powerful, thoughtful, deeply intense human, incredible orator. Du Bois, not the best talker, not the best orator, brilliant writer, not the best orator. Booker T. Washington could fire up a crowd, incredible charisma, and has literally gone from enslavement to the president of a well-respected college, right? Has had a clear, sustainable vision that even Woodrow Wilson can get behind, right? So I can imagine there are some different resources. And I don't think that their conflict is a fighting for the soul of Black America. I don't think that's true. But I do think they have different experiences and thus different stories to tell about the Black experience. And they're speaking clearly, cogently, poignantly, but perhaps a bit myopically, both of them, out of their own experience.
I would agree with that. And certainly what Washington is able to do is to capture those white Northern philanthropists' dollars and to say exactly what is to be done with them. And so the things like research that Du Bois wanted to do when he was at Atlanta, in his Atlanta studies, is something that Washington doesn't see as necessary. And so Du Bois, I don't know whether it was a meager resources, but whatever resources Washington had to give his okay, because he had the lead and the mind of the white philanthropists at that time. And so, of course, that frustrated Du Bois, that he couldn't get the monies that he needed to do all of the studies that he wanted to do. I mean, think what he would have done had he had money. Think of what he would have produced. And we know what he did produce without the money. Think what if he had the money, what he would have produced, one way or the other. So thank you. Next week, we are going to go on to chapter 7, and we will have with us another colleague of Dr. Ballard's. We will have Dr. Gretchen Long, who is a professor of history at Williams College, join us next week for chapter 7. And we hope that you guys will join us again for that. Please stay tuned for a short film about Clinton Church restoration made by Silo Media. And please help us make Clinton Church restoration and at African American Heritage Center alive by donating your pennies and your dollars. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Ballard.
Thank you all.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea.
Hello, I'm Ray Gunn, chairman of the Clinton Church Restoration Project. We are creating a nonprofit center for African American history and culture at the historic Clinton A.M.E. Zion Church in Great Barrington, which I attended for over 70 years. The Berkshires are rich with Black history that is little known and sometimes misunderstood. For example, my ancestor, Agrippa Hull, served in the Revolutionary War and was the largest Black landowner in Stockbridge. Once completed, our center will tell his story and those of W.E.B. Du Bois, Reverend Esther Dozier, and many more. Please help by donating to this historic project. We need your support. Thank you.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, there's no hiding place down there. Oh, there's no hiding place down there. See, I went to the rock to hide my face. Rock cried out, no hiding place down there. Gonna pitch tent on the old campground. Pitch my tent on the old campground. Gonna pitch my tent on the old campground. Give that devil another round. No hiding place down there. See, there's no hiding place down there. Oh, there's no hiding place down there. See, went to the rock to hide my face. Rock cried out, no hiding place down there. No hiding place down there. Oh, there's no hiding place down there.